Shalom Aleichem from New York.
So, welcome everybody. I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to this program with Dr. Elissa Sampson entitled Opening a Confiscated Archive, A View of the Interracial Yiddish Left's Origins and Impact. This evening is in partnership with the Workers' Circle Arbitering of Northern California, and I want to thank them for suggesting this event and for their support. And I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do at the library possible. Tonight's program is made possible in part by Judy Baston. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and will all be muted, but you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end using Zoom's chat function. So put your questions in the chat and I'll relay them to our speaker, time permitting. I'm especially appreciative of those scholars who make vivid for us chapters in history that are at risk of being forgotten. I had never actually heard of the International Workers' Order until reading Kenneth Kahn's excellent oral history of the Jewish immigrants in Petaluma, where the IWO was central to the community. And there were lodges in San Francisco and Oakland and Los Angeles, all active in both culture and politics, but I never really knew this story behind the organization. And there is nobody more equipped to tell that story than Elissa Sampson. She's the co-editor with Robert Zecker of From Popular Front to Cold War, The Interracial Left and the International Workers' Order, 1930 to 1954, which just came out earlier this year from Cornell University Press. As a research associate in Cornell University's Jewish Studies program, she played a central role in Cornell's archives on the IWO and the Jewish People's Fraternal Order. She's a multifaceted urban geographer whose work has examined immigrant culture in New York, Jerusalem, Paris, and elsewhere, and she has taught labor and gender history, including the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and how it is remembered today. Elissa, I am so glad to have you with us again. It is now all yours.
I am honored, flattered, and if I speak in New York dulcet tones, it is because I am from New York. It's an honest confession. And if you want to show the slides, we can start. So there's always a story when one is opening a confiscated archive. And by that I mean there's a way in which, if you'll forgive the word, a confiscated archive is simply treif, or not kosher, if you will, because there's a reason it's been confiscated. And in this case, it was the International Workers' Order, Aleph, 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 very original. You just stick to one letter of the alphabet. Um, and its Jewish section, its name changes over time, but it's basically becomes the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, the JPFO. And I found myself at Cornell with this particular confiscated archive and found a lot of surprises in it, as well as things that I might have expected. Now, by way of explanation, when you have a confiscated archive, you do know why it was confiscated. In this case, the IWO was shut down in 1954 officially, but practically a year before that, by a combination of insurance law and the U.S. Supreme Court refusing appeals because they had been on the red list from Attorney General Tom Clark. And how they made the red list is basically because they were a fraternal organization. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with a fraternal organization, they're things like Knights of Columbus. They are not particularly the leading edge of organizational society at the point we're talking about, which is the Depression up until the Cold War. And many have politics, but some just do mutual aid benefits because people need to have benefits, typically for burial insurance, to be crude about the matter. But there are other types of insurance as well. Now, I found myself in this archive that I knew was confiscated, and I knew the reason the organization had shut down. Um, was that it had been shut down, and its archives confiscated by New York State under a very unusual provision of insurance law, in which there was a claim, and it didn't really last very long because it's a unique claim, that if they were pro-Soviet, in theory, they could take their actuarial assets and transfer them to Uncle Joe, as he was known at the time, or Stalin, or the head of the USSR. However preposterous this claim was, because their assets were quite conservative, U.S. savings bonds and cash, because they were an insurance company that did politics as well. But there were two sides to that house. I found myself really intrigued by not simply the question of why it was confiscated and what it contained and what it showed about Jewish life and the Yiddish left at its beginnings, many things, and I will show you some of those images. But I found myself fascinated increasingly by the fact that while they started in 1930, by 1932, they're interethnic, they're interracial, they've extended their benefit package, and I will show you some of those images. And the people they invite in tend to be Black nationalists and often very famous in their day. I'd also like to say something that is worth thinking about right now, which is we have an organization, and I will explain this further because we'll have two parts to this presentation, in which the leadership, to some degree, was aligned with that of what I call the CP orbit. They may or may not have been members, but 90% of the people who were actually members, just like chicken farmers in Petaluma or elsewhere, were not actually members of the CPUSA. So we end up with a pro-Soviet organization whose largest section is its Yiddish-speaking section, and Black nationalists and many others, including Slavs, Italians, Greeks, Finns. But what I'm going to show you is really the story of how the IWO gets started, what some of these documents show over the years, and some biographies as well that illustrate these documents and the importance of a certain political moment in terms of civil rights and many other things. Now, when you deal with Jewish and Black diasporas in history in the United States, there is no claim here these histories are commensurate or identical when you're talking about allyship or solidarity or anything else. But there is a claim that they're very much intertwined, and one can see that in these documents. Right now, for instance, you are seeing a picture of the Hammer, or the hammer, um, and it is a radical magazine with top-notch covers and graphics from the 20s, because the IWO comes out of a grouping called Bilinka, or the left. To your right, you will, or my right at least, you will see a Rockwell Kent illustration of the logo they used in the 40s. And Rockwell Kent was a very famous artist. Some of you might know his work. He was not a communist, for instance, but he was president of the IWO. And Rockwell Kent's drawings will show you, for instance, that his vision of an America that can be and should be was very much one that was integrated. So if you look at that logo, you'll see something very different than the May Day logo that you see with the hammer. What you're seeing is a flag and people marching behind that banner who are unified. And that is part of that vision. So next slide, please. Here we have the unique appeal of the IWO. By the time it was closed down, it had about 188,000 members, and again, 40% were from the Jewish section. But you have illustrations that I think are absolutely stunning in terms of modernism. These are very sophisticated artists. And one of the things that's really interesting here is because they do commemorative books and booklets, and the one from the left says New York, 1937, and it is from the 10th year anniversary of the Jewish Workers' University. Oh, who knew we had a Jewish Workers' University? Well, somebody did because they founded it. So that comes out of Linka and then becomes associated with the IWO. And in effect, you have a crowd of people who are workers because they can't go to school in the daytime. They have to hold down day jobs, as they say. So they go to school at night in Yiddish and they learn about whether it's Marxism, organizing workers, whatever it is. But you can see from these stunning graphics just how serious an institution it is. Now, we also have a booklet called 5 Years IWO, and you have that beautiful sort of deco logo, almost like a megaphone, right? And then you have each of the societies in the IWO. Did I mention that there are 16 languages in the IWO in these archives? Because they amalgamated in 1932 after getting founded in 1930. They break away from the Arbeiterring, or the Workers' Circle, as it's called today, and the radical part that's affected by the Bolshevik Revolution. And because they're radical, and because they believe in this question of an identity, of a worker's identity, and that a worker can be Jewish, and it's a natural identity, even if it's a marked identity, and that worker can be Yiddish speaking or Italian speaking or anything else. They believe that it is important to amalgamate the other sort of Landsmannschaft or mutual aid societies that they see out there. And the others aren't Jewish. So you get Hungarians, you get Slovaks, and you get Black nationalists, among others. Now, I call this unity and diversity, but that is what anybody who's reading through these archives is going to tell you. And part of the reason it's unity and diversity is because by the time you hit 16 languages with English as the lingua franca, and that deserves a bit more explanation, you end up with people with almost vertical and horizontal connections. Vertical because they're creating their own secular culture and they're formulating this identity of what it means to be fused with a worker and with a folk culture and many other things. And the relationship to the CP is both strong and dicey for the leadership, because CP has already dissolved the language societies officially, and these people are sort of, practicing their Yiddish and making it even more beautiful because they are publishers. They're one of the biggest Yiddish publishers out there by the time you hit the end of the IWO. Now, we end up with this fraternal order, which is already an old-fashioned formation, but it provides mutual aid. They don't mark up the benefits. So for those of you who are used to Workers' Circle, you know that there are many Landsmannschaft in our hometown society or lodges that affiliate for benefits. It's a typical thing to do to take a package, but this package is a very good one because it's equivalent or better in every case to the one that Workers' Circle offered, plus there's no markup. So you end up with this fraternal order that immediately attracts people. Starts off with 5,000 people, but grows very rapidly. And what they say basically is no to the racial ladder. They equate Jim Crow and lynchings to pogroms. That's a very big thing to do. And Having made that leap, they are embracing people that normally don't get embraced from an actuarial point of view. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But basically, when you're looking at joining any sort of insurance society or mutual aid society, actuaries run the show in terms of setting rates. These people didn't discriminate. IWO didn't discriminate. And again, it starts off as Aleph, 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 ordering, right? The order. Um, they didn't discriminate in terms of rates. You could be a steel worker, you could be a garment worker, same rate. You could be a coal miner, same rate. You could be Jewish, you could be black, you could be Italian, same rate. And I'll show you a bit about that. So when you have something that brings people together as a deep belief, and I would say it's more than ideology, it's identity here that gets created, fused, and already exists to a large degree as a naturalized identity, being leftist and Jewish, a worker, almost always secular. You end up with something very interesting. Now we have two camps, Ochika, or Workers' Children's Camp, and Kinderland, which some of you might have heard of. Kinderland, you know, you know, I used to say if they got to their 100th anniversary, it'd be a big deal. And that was 10, 20 years ago. They made it there. And now I say, bis 120, 120 and keep on going. Kinderland's doing fine. They get new campus. So Wochica did close down in the 50s. That's very much associated with the story of Paul Robeson, who we'll be looking at. But Wochica is also interesting because it's very much an integrated camp. So with the IWO, you're going to see the horizontal as well. And Wochica is very much the horizontal, in which you have the arts and you're going to have more of an emphasis on Black culture. Um, um, those of you who are familiar with the song Strange Fruit, I don't see your faces, so I can't know if you're giving me a virtual nod or whatever, but you can do a reaction in Zoom to let me know if you've heard of Strange Fruit. But Strange Fruit was written by the Maripoles as a poem. Yes, somebody recognizes it. Good. And it was published in Fraternal Order, which is the magazine of the IWO, which is in English, but also in some of these other languages. Again, we work our way up to 16. The Maripoles, who were the Rosenberg kids, went to Bochica because they were adopted by the Maripole family. And Strange Fruit was sung in Cafe Society, which does have a connection to the IWO. Um, and it was the first integrated audience in New York City or anywhere in terms of jazz. So that song is famous, but the poem was written before that, and the Maripoles belonged to the party, but sent their kids to Bochica, and the grandchildren went to Kinderland. Um, why do I emphasize this lingua franca? Two reasons. One, when you end up with 15 languages, you have to figure out how to talk to each other, right? So English is important in the IWM, and most of the materials are in English. So what I digitize, and I'll talk about that later, I did put an emphasis on the Yiddish materials so that people would have access to them and could draw their own conclusions about this part of the Jewish left. I say draw their own conclusions because it is very clear, this interraciality, this embrace of the other, and this type of solidarity. But it's also very clear they're pro-Soviet. You don't waste time wondering what New York State tried to prove in court, which was that there were people connected to the party. Um, it's also interesting as a lingua franca because if you're African American, it's your native language. And so you're more invested in it. And then if you're younger, right? Meaning you're born in America or you came as a young immigrant, and maybe your native tongue as well. So many of the lodges were within a language or ethnic society, but there were also integrated lodges. And eventually they become mainly black lodges, which are called concentration lodges because they're in concentration areas like Harlem or South Side in Chicago. So you end up with this very interesting type of lodge situation and these sections which are both vertical and horizontal at the same time. And I'm just going to try three slogans on you and to give you a sense of what they were trying based on their pronouncements on this topic. Immigrants won, immigrants all. Okay. No Jim Crow in the IWO. And I actually have heard people recite that, meaning in terms of their hiring policies, in terms of promotion, they're absolute, in terms of representation on their general executive board. They're very serious about this, very fast. And white and Negro unity, which is a phrase that you will see in the CP, and there are different formulations of that. Um, and obviously, there's nothing derogatory in this time period in using the term Negro. It's the preferred term, actually, on the part of the actors that you will see. And when I say actors, I'm not referring to Mr. Robeson professionally, but membership, leadership. And you can see this attention because African Americans typically are not immigrants. But all these things have to be part of this. And so, next slide, please. So we meet the people who say no to the racial ladder and are not necessarily enjoying social mobility as is typically understood by demographers. The first slide here, or first image here rather, is of prolet shul. Okay, you may ask, what is a prolet shul? A proletarian shul or a shula. Now, these are after schools. Unlike the Jewish Workers University, which is really for adults, this is for kids right after they get out of school, including on Saturday or Shabbos. And so you have in the Bronx, and you have in Brooklyn, and you have in LA, and you have any place, Chicago, any place in which you have enough of an IWO presence. And again, within 2 years, they end up inviting in these other groups and opening up their benefit package. And then the head of the IWO, Reuven Zaltzman, basically takes a step backwards and becomes the head of the Jewish section. And all of a sudden, the children's magazines change. You can see New Rays, right, to the my right from 1927. Now, you had something called the Umpateish, or the, no, I'm going to just call them the unaffiliated, but the people that are breaking off from Workers' Circle. And they have lovely professional graphics on their stuff. And the Umpateish do this to some degree as well. But the unaffiliated shulas start drifting very rapidly towards the order, as it's called in English. And so you get some really radical children's art, as in Prolet Shul. A kid drew that. And they start using images of hammers and sickles. And so the hand drawn and the child at its center and the child's education become really central. And one of the things that interested me in this is that I think of these people as stranded immigrants because the gates, as we know, to the US closed between 21 to 24. And they are busy forging this identity, even though the gates are closed. They are radicalizing, even though the Bolshevik Revolution happened in two waves in 1917, which tells us how deep this identity was for them, that this time gap is one that they can stay in and then, as part of the Linka, make this move into forming their own fraternal organization. Now, you can see why in the Depression benefits would be attractive, especially without a markup. But having said that, I'm going to just read out loud one line here. Accepts members, irrespective of sex, nationality, color, creed, or political belief. Now, again, we would say perhaps this is the norm that insurance companies should have, mutual aid associations. It certainly wasn't the norm in the day, and it certainly wasn't the norm even 15, 20 years ago when there was still a bunch of lawsuits against major insurance companies because they had different rates for people who were African American, different policies that were called industrial and substandard. That was the language. And those companies lost in court. Actually, those who absolutely refused to insure African Americans did better because they couldn't get sued. But these were mass lawsuits, and you can look them up. They're a matter of record. So, what I'm going to say about allyship is that it involves daily work and contestation, and it's both easy and not easy. What do I mean by uneasy? I think the tensions are somewhat obvious in bringing together people from very diverse backgrounds and economic situations, though probably it's fair to say this was not the richest fraternal order around. Um, but the allyship gets formed and it's quite real. And I'd like to show you that in some of the documents. Now, I also have a document here explaining in English that the IWO is a new workers' stronghold because they were forced, as I said, to publish in English, plus New York State requires certain things in English. But what you can see here is that this identity that happens in a fairly radical period in terms of CP politics that people refer to as the third period or whatever, moves very rapidly into the popular front. And once it moves into the popular front, that makes everything easier in terms of dealing with party politics and in terms of allyship, because people get they have to fight fascism and unify. And when you have an overwhelming belief in that and in equality, that's very telling. So one of the things I'd like to point out actually about that prolotariat that I chose here to show you is that it's full of articles about Scottsboro. And can I have a show of virtual hands about those who have heard about Scottsboro? Yes, yes, Scottsboro, right? The defendants, all nine of them. And we're going to hear more about them. But all these little kids' journals from the shores, they're writing essays about Scottsboro. And the IWO is busy organizing in Alabama and for Scottsboro and in mining towns. So all this and shared tactics and strategies is essential to them. Next slide, please. Okay, a study in contrast. So I don't know if people have heard of Yankov or Jacob Schaefer and the Freiheit Gesangverein. which is a singing group, a workers' chorus, but I'm told there may be people in the Bay Area who have sung in Yiddish. Show your virtual hand if you have, because singing is now de rigueur for people who are doing various things and organizing community. Right. And singing in Yiddish has taken on a new life. But this is from 1932. I'm going to point out that those faces are similar to what you see in terms of who goes to the Jewish Workers' University. What do I mean by that? You have to go at night. You still need a job. It's the depression. You're lucky if you have one. And so the songbook is fascinating, in part because Yankov Schaefer wants to train Jewish workers, and some of them are not literate, in music. So they have to learn to read music. They have to learn, for those who already know how to read Yiddish or Hebrew, two different languages, right? They have to learn how to scan something from left to right. That is not an easy thing to do if you're an adult immigrant, by the way. And you're going to be introduced, if Mr. Schaefer is in charge of your music education, to things like Bach and Beethoven, as well as to The Star Rises over Azerbaijan. So he has a mix of stuff, and it's fascinating. Now, fast forward to 1954 and the world of Shalom Aleichem. Who here has heard of Herschel Bernardi? Virtual hands again. It helps. I got her Howard's, yes. Okay, famous actor back in his day. Now you know what his politics were. Okay, so there are people we call fellow travelers, and those are the people who are part of the Jewish section in this case. And they are well known within the politics and the music and the performances you see in the Jewish section. And there's a guy named Serge Hovey, who's probably the only person involved in this particular concert who actually isn't blacklisted. Now, the reason I gave you the date on this concert is it indicates a lot of things. One, that people in the JPFO are making the claim, and I saw it constantly, and we'll see some of these documents, that they were connected to American Jewish history. That's really interesting for immigrants because in some cases it's sort of a stretch, like Chaim Solomon, right? The financier of the American Revolution. Two, you will note this is an integrated chorus in Yiddish. They also do African American songs, by the way. Three, for those who are fans or not fans of Fiddler on the Roof, this is also the origins of Fiddler on the Roof, the Shalom Aleichem suite. And Arnold Pearl is also involved, as well as many other people who are part of the JPFO. Now, if you think about what's interesting in an archive, especially a confiscated one, somebody like myself and a group of other scholars have been concentrating on what we call lived life. In other words, what are people actually doing? We need to understand the ideology. And I've put together a timeline, and you'll get a link for that. But we also need to understand what are people actually doing when they're talking about any particular issue. Because it's in lived life, one forms community and ties. And one sees the things that are contradictory or contested or difficult or sometimes apologetic even, that have to be figured out together. And so lived life really is the focus of the documents I'm going to show you. Now, again, this concert that's happening at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the IWO has been shut down legally. The Jewish young folk singers keep on singing. And they come out of group called the Jewish Young Fraternalists, which is part of the JPFO. They just keep on singing and booking concerts. That's fascinating. They have no legal standing as far as I've been able to tell. They just kept on going through the Cold War. And perhaps there's a lesson there. Um, again, there's no defense of Stalinism here on my part or that of anybody else, I think, who has any sense about the matter. But there is a confusion that you see, and I use that word loosely, in which the defense of the Soviet state is seen as the defense of the worker state and socialism, and that becomes complicated. Having said that, again, almost none of the members were actually party members. Even if they read the box scores in the Daily Worker or the Morgen Freiheit, which was known, by the way, for its sports reporting, among other things, as well as its kosher butcher ads. So you have all the contradictions in front of you when you look at this part of the Yiddish-speaking left. Next, please. So I thought this one might cheer somebody up. For the Yiddish speakers here, right? It's Jews in America, right? And freedom labor organization struggles, right? In America, Freiheitskampfen. It's by Morris Shappies. And you can see he's absolutely determined in 48, which is already a bad year in terms of the Cold War and the state apparatus bearing down on the IWO. He's busy talking about the freedom struggles that Jews have participated in and continue to participate in. Now, the fact that they think that in 48 they should still be publishing in Yiddish is fascinating because as time goes on, as you would expect, there is going to be more and more in English on the part of the JPFO. And this flyer from Lodge 817, which had its own letterhead, the Fraternalist, right? Talks about National Negro History Week because this becomes central to the JPFO and every other part of the IWO, the observance of something that started with Carter Woodson, right? As in terms of bringing Black history to people's attention. So you have something that is critical here. And by the way, I was introduced to the idea that there should be a Jewish History Week because they start publishing flyers about Jewish History Week. Now, I am told by Gemini and ChatGPT that Jewish History Month is something that started in 1980, but nobody bothered telling the people in the 40s that Jewish History Week shouldn't exist, so they invented it then, as far as I can tell. And again, I think of this as multi-directional memory because we're going to see some of the people involved and how memory can ricochet and solidarities get built and identities that are vertical and important and natural and marked can also get fused in new ways and infused with a type of solidarity. And I want to stress that the Cold War was actually bad news. It's not some headline that you read in the LA Times or whatever, or the San Francisco Chronicle, whatever exists still. But the Cold War basically meant that many of these people lost their jobs, were blacklisted, some were denaturalized, and some were deported. Shappies, for instance, spent time in an unpleasant institution behind bars because by the 30s he already had spoken up enough at CUNY where he had been an instructor, and so he got actually jailed for violating the Couder Act. So he was an early one on that one, a true premature anti-fascist. And he was one of the founding editors of Jewish Life, which became Jewish Currents. So Chappie's is a name to bear in mind. Next, please. Are there Langston Hughes fans here? Show of hands. He's a poet. He's a playwright. He's many other things. Yes. Okay. I see that Emily believes that Langston Hughes is worth paying attention to. He gets involved in a call for a cultural conference, and I put the call out here because I know that this sort of stuff can be eye charts. So in 1942, Langston Hughes is saying the following. He's calling for a cultural conference, the creation of a new organization. And what he is saying is straightforward, but it's not the weapons that most people associate with World War II. So we're in the cultural front, and the cultural front is absolutely essential to the IWO. In this global war against fascism, the music, songs, drama, dances of the people are mighty weapons. Let's use them. Okay? Strong words, but hard to shift into tanks from that. But perhaps he's right. It is absolutely essential to have the cultural front if one's going to work together and bond in the most basic of ways in a common cause. In World War II, and fighting Nazis, and before that, fighting fascists was a common cause. See that book, A New Song? The IWO published that book and took a risk in some sense because Langston Hughes was a known poet in the Harlem Renaissance, but not as well known as he should have been based on the quality of his work. And so this book is published in 1938, and he's able to use some of his poems, Good Morning Revolution, among them, but some others that you might know as well, right? And he talks about America, the America that should be, and what being an American might be, and the dreams that people should have about America. If you go up on YouTube, you will see many videos of two of his most famous poems that are in this book. He's also the animator, along with his friend Louise Thompson, and we'll be talking about her shortly, of the Harlem Suitcase Theater, in which they take Langston Hughes poems and make them into plays, primarily Black audiences in Harlem, because he lives above a place called Frank's, which is a restaurant, and the Solidarity Lodge gets founded there, and it becomes, among many other things, the Solidarity Lodge becomes actually the home to the Suitcase Theater. And the actors you're asking? That's very simple. People who show up at the Solidarity Lodge, they get either a bit part or something bigger than that, depending on the role and the person. And the most famous of his plays is Don't You Want to Be Free, which is a fascinating play because it's a poem and you get half stage directions, which tell you what is happening. And those of you who know James Earl Jones, his father was one of the actors and got one of his starts in the Suitcase Theater. Now, you're asking, right? What is that booklet in Yiddish? Well, Langston Hughes becomes a hit with the Yiddish left, unsurprisingly. And so in 1936 in Moscow, Bob, you basically have a booklet with two printings in Moscow. And believe me, paper is not a strong suit. in the Moscow of the 1930s. And so you have a booklet of Harlem Renaissance poems. A lot of them are Langston Hughes poems, and they're very, very, very well translated. But many are of people who are less well known, who are part of the Harlem Renaissance. So in 36, we have this booklet coming out. There are North American readers who are reading in Yiddish, but the working assumption is that A, there are only 2 copies of this thing, and yes, I did vault this one at Cornell because there are only 2 copies known in the world of this particular booklet. And secondly, because its audience is probably people who are speaking Yiddish in the Soviet Union, even though Yiddish is becoming somewhat unpopular with the state authorities at that point. But it's seen as folklore. The book is popularized as universal folklore. And that's what gets it by and allows it to be popular. Next, please. So we're back to Negro History Week. And here's a bulletin from 1945. And look at that stunning graphic. The people creating these graphics, by the way, are Black artists, typically African American, some also Afro-Caribbean. Now, if you look at that stunning graphic, it brings in a lot of different themes. They're urban themes, they're themes of Africa, they're themes of Ethiopia, the themes, and that becomes important in the 30s because Mussolini invades Ethiopia. But it's very Afrocentric and it's very modernistic and very powerful. Now, if you read through the bulletin, and it's obviously right after World War II, it's giving you a discussion outline for your lodge on how to discuss Negro History Week. Um, there are 3 points they want to have made. One, the struggle for liberation, the fight to overthrow the slave system, period, from American Revolution through the Civil War. 2, John Brown. Oh, rebellion. And rebellion that's integrated because John Brown's band, for those of you who know John Brown's history in Kansas, we're not at Harpeth Ferry quite yet, had indigenous fighters. It had people who were called white back in the day. It also had 3 Jews. Now, liberation and John Brown. Interesting. And we'll see a third theme as well. Next, please. I don't know if the graphic is by Jacob Lawrence, but Jacob Lawrence taught art, by the way, at Camp Bochica. Okay, we do have a little bit of an eye chart here. So let's start with Negro History Week in 1947 and 48. And again, the themes are going to be liberation, and that's Black leadership, integration, and John Brown, rebellion. Okay. The unbreakable unity of Negro and white is the burning need of these decisive days when the people's ranks must be solidly formed for the winning of democracy, security, and lasting peace, and for the defeat of Jim Crow and anti-Semitism to end lynching and all forms of discrimination. It's in their words and in their images. And in appreciation of Negro History Week is a flyer so you can order the full bulletin. So it's, the Vorspeise, the appetizer that gets you to order that. But again, a stunning graphic. Now, The other stunning graphic, which is harder to see, is that they're showing you in the 1948 version what happens here in terms of looking at demographics and education and literacy and the poll tax and where people live, the actual impact of enslavement and the lasting violence on people's lives. And so while it's an eye chart, it actually is a very, very good graphic because it summarizes 8 pages of statistics into one picture. Now, this other graphic in which you have a hammer and sickle also comes from one of those anniversary journals. And here you have the worker, the strong worker that's paired together. But I also have lots of images, and I'm not showing you them tonight in the interest of time, in which the hammer and the sickle and the black and the white worker are somewhat different. And that is, you have something that's more akin to the Soviet version of a type of Leninist idea that you have the industrial worker and the peasant and the serf uniting. So they're going to show you people in places like Alabama in which you had white and black sharecroppers being organized by communists and also by the IWO. And again, Louise Thompson, who we'll be hearing more about, is involved in that type of work as well as in Scottsboro. So you can see 2 different types of images typically when you have a black and white worker united with a hammer and sickle. Again, the rural with the black belt or the more industrial, which is what you see here. Next, please. What happens with World War II? Interesting. Okay. Has anybody here heard of a poet called Peretz Markish? Show of hands works. I see at least 2. Okay. He was a very famous Yiddish poet, and he was part of a group, 3, wow, who was really the head, so to speak, in many ways, along with uh, Shlomo Michols and others, of something called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Now remember that in the Soviet Union, you have this, what I would call unpleasant, and again, small quotes here, moment in which you have something called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in which Stalin and Hitler agree not to attack each other, and Poland, among other things, gets divided up. So all of a sudden, there are a bunch of Polish Jews who are on literally the eastern side of the border of the San River who find themselves in a Soviet world, and many of them head further east. But you already have Yiddish-speaking Jews in the Soviet Union. So Peretz Markish is a famous poet, and of course, Hitler turns on the Soviet Union, no surprise there, right? And when he does, among many other things, Moscow gets attacked. So this booklet, which is extraordinarily rare and is also vaulted for that reason, because I believe there are only 2 copies in the world. And I would love somebody to tell me there's a third, was printed in Moscow before the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee had to go to the new Soviet capital, Kubashev, further east for safety reasons, and they did get evacuated. The importance of these poets can't be understated because in this month before Moscow was attacked, they got paper. There is no greater compliment to poets than getting paper in 1941 in Moscow. Now you also have a cartoon here, and It is a cartoon that makes certain claims. You can see a discommoded Nazi. You see a bunch of tanks. The JPFO decides that it's going to raise money for tanks and actually can't do that because just same way you as an individual can't go out and buy a tank, hopefully, the JPFO could not do that either. Having said that, they raised a lot of money, um, and the money went to Soviet relief and also to the anti-fascist committee. But in terms of claims that interest me, it may be a bit of, again, an eye chart, but each tank is assigned a country. So American Jews are assigned a country, and each country that's going to help with these tanks that has a Jewish valence is going to have a name associated with it. So we get Chaim Solomon here. We also get Spinoza, who's probably turning over in his virtual grave because it would be very hard for him to understand as a philosopher what is happening with World War II. We get Bar Kokhba, who certainly was a nationalist when it came to a Reuben rebellion. So we get everyone from Jewish history represented here, and it's a fascinating cartoon. Last but not least, we also get a response to the radio broadcasts that come out of Moscow from the Anti-Fascist Committee asking for help, asking for aid. And there's actually a tour that happens, which Itzik Pfeffer, Shlomo Michals come to New York, they come to Canada, they come to Mexico. They raise money, around $7 million, to help raise money for the war. Now, are they on a short string? Probably, in the sense that their platform is that of Jewish unity. In other words, Jews, put aside your difference. The two main branches of Judaism are coming together, the Soviet and the American. And Yiddish is an asset because it is the only thing that works as a lingua franca. And so Pfeffer goes to Kinderland. Michal manages to break his arm. But we have a radio broadcast in which the JPFO, which is very, very good at assembling coalitions, brings in every macha from New York City who can speak Yiddish, regardless practically of their politics, to tell the Anti-Fascist Committee, we heard your shortwave broadcast. We are responding. We understand the threat you're under. We will help. And it's a fascinating booklet. And that is online, as is the graphic cartoon. Next, please. There's a book called The Warsaw Ghetto, Never Forget. And this is a name from the past that I don't know if people remember, and that is Howard Fast. He was a writer. He's known probably best for a film called Spartacus. He made The Blacklist spectacularly. Um, he was a very strong writer, sort of like a book a year sort of person, and did a lot of screenplays, among other things. And he enlists Grappa, who's a great cartoonist, as you saw with the tanks, and also works with, yes, somebody recognizes Howard Fast. And Howard Fast becomes a party member, according to his own account, because, and I'm going to paraphrase this, at some point he thinks that the Soviet Union and Stalin are the last men standing, meaning there's nobody left to oppose Hitler. And this is very, I wouldn't say typical because the quality is fantastic, but does typify the type of deep mourning that happens in the wake of the war and the reformation of the JPFO in terms of understanding Jewish identity in that context. So if you'll permit me a simple line, and you will see that I had to think about trigger warnings and looking at the drawings from the book. I would suggest that the hanging figures with the Nazis rejoicing is also evocative of lynching, but that's simply an opinion. Fast doesn't say that himself. If the stones of Warsaw had tongues, lips, and memory, they would tell a tale and render an accounting. But how else might it be itemized so that one could explain the 42 days? A peaceful people, a patient people, yet that is only a part of it. A people with a memory of many things. And so the Warsaw Ghetto becomes central, and its commemorations are very rapid in the JPFO worlds. And I believe they are some of the first commemorations of the ghetto, and they include programs for children. This is not stuff they hide from children. It's very interesting. Next, please. And I'm going to show you some biographical sketches and documents that most of which, but not all of which, come out of this confiscated archive. But they will flesh out some of these stories and connections in terms of allyship and how people work together in terms of tactics, strategy, and daily life. So Paul Robeson, and I think I should get a lot of virtual hands here, right? Yes, definitely one. 3, 4, keep on going. Okay, he's a polyglot, many languages. Yiddish is one of them. He's a polymath, meaning he's an athlete. He's a Shakespearean actor, and you actually have to study how to be a Shakespearean actor if you start doing it and you're not British and you haven't been trained in that tradition. It is an enormous jump, and nobody who's African American has ever played Othello. It's always been played in blackface, right? He becomes a film actor, right? Old Man River, many other things. A stage actor, which he prefers to film. A singer was a basso profundo. He forms his own recording label, Othello, yes, with the character in question. And he's a lawyer, which is relevant to our story. And he prefers to actually have integrated audiences. It's already a big thing if the cast gets integrated. Getting an audience integrated is no joke back in the day, including in the North, may I add. This is not a Southern problem. So one of the things that happens is he does end up becoming a spokesperson for the IWO. He lends his voice, he lends his time. He is active in the camps, and we're going to look at some of these images. He gets hauled in front of UAC, right? UAC is an acronym here, right, for the House on Committee, on American Affairs, whatever. And he gets involved in what I call the passport wars, in which a very high percentage of the people he hangs out with in the IWO get their passports revoked. And a different IWO vice president, Vito Marcantonio, who's a 7-term congressperson from East Harlem, gets involved with trying to advocate for most of them in terms of trying to get their passports back or keep them out of jail. He's also very much the person involved with the Peekskill riots because he's doing a benefit concert for the Civil Rights Congress, and we're going to look at an actual press release from that year from that day that gets issued by the IWO. And he's involved because he's a lawyer and he presents We Charge Genocide, which is a petition that's primarily authored by William Patterson, who we will meet shortly. He presents it to the UN in New York. Well, William Patterson goes to meet with the UN in Geneva to present a petition that basically talks about the violence against Black people. The UN does not accept the petition, but it is a lawyerly brief, and we're going to look at some of that language. But before we get there, let's start with Chicago. Chicago does recruiting campaigns, and they're very much in South Side, and they're oriented at letting people know about the benefits that they can get in terms of mutual aid without a markup right after the war, no discrimination. And so you have Robeson saying why in this pamphlet, it's a recruitment pamphlet, why he believes people should join the IWO. So in his words, in the IWO, peoples of many nationalities, Negro and white, live and work together in a true fraternal spirit and the kind of genuine democracy I would like to see practiced in all of America. I value my membership in the order. Next, please. Now we have in 1935, in Yiddish and in English, flyers from the Council of Working Class Women. Okay, Benita Williams is going to be in the Amsterdam News, which you see on to the right of the image that's in Yiddish. And we have meat boycotts in Harlem that spread to Brighton Beach and Brownsville and Newark, and they bring the price of meat down. This is a entirely successful boycott. And you have women working together, and they include Clara Lemlich, June Gordon, Louise Thompson, and Benita Williams. It is an amazing moment in which you have the Yiddish and the English together in terms of describing the boycott. Next, please. We have June Gordon, who's probably one of the most radical people you could possibly have met back in the day. So now June Gordon, who's an immigrant, a child immigrant who crosses the border from Canada, is one of these women from the United Council of Working Class Women, and they become the Progressive Women's Council, and she works with Lemlich, and they merge into the IWO, but the focus is on women. And once you have a focus on women as a constituency, it gives the IWO every incentive to see them as leaders. And she marries a Black journalist who's well known in CP circles named Eugene Gordon. She is stateless. She becomes denaturalized as a result of the Cold War. And the Pattersons, who we're about to meet, are her pallbearers. And to the left, she's with Ruben Zaltzman, right? Top left on my screen. And they're at a banquet because the Emmas, as they are known, become famous in Jewish history as one of the most radical and organized women's groups. Next, please. Here's a letter from June Gordon in 1945 when you have an Emma Lazarus division as part of the IWO. Now, I think of this as a very radical letter in many ways, but I think of it also as a letter in which we see that people in the Emmas and the IWO are not a great example of social mobility. They describe themselves as white. They describe themselves as suffering the effects of discrimination. And they overtly describe themselves as Jews. And you have the call out here that I put. So I'm not going to read that to you. But I found a different call out that's not in this letter. And she talks about what it's like to be a Jewish parent after the war, in which the problems of rearing a Jewish child in a democracy that allows the worm of anti-Semitism and race discrimination to bore within and break the hearts, if not the lives of our children, is really the central problem that she's trying to address. The Emmas were formidable, and we're going to meet them again. Next, please. Now, at one point, the Emmas tried to modernize, as you can tell. For those, has anybody here ever seen a photo of the Emmas back in the day with bathing caps on and they're older and a little, they're not svelte typically. This is when the Emmas are trying to recruit younger women, and you can tell there's a different type of graphic involved, right? Join a progressive women's organization. But the Emmas that you see in that Polaroid photo have gone to France. And while it's hard to make out, you should be able to see Marc Chagall in that, because Marc Chagall was a fellow traveler. And he spent his time during the war publishing his wife Bella's memoirs and one other book with the IWO, which was a big Yiddish publisher. And he lends his name and effort to supporting wartime orphans in both Belgium and France. And this is a real orphanage in Interracial, in which actually the teenagers who were orphaned run the school for the younger orphans, and they were hidden in a chateau in a remote area. And the Emmas step up and do these virtual adoption kits, send clothing and money, and Chagall raises the money to try to rebuild the building and feed these orphans, to his credit. Next, please. Now we're meeting Louise Thompson Patterson. Louise is with Ruben Zaltzman. Now we have an older Louise here, as we can see, because Louise is embracing Ruben Zaltzman at a convention. But you can see the younger Louise Thompson when she's a new woman and she's an IWO vice president. And if you look underneath that picture of a new woman, you will see she is with her friend Paul Robeson. So she is the magic glue that brings Robeson and Hughes into the IWO, as well as Walter Garland, who's a hero of the Spanish Civil War and World War One, and is Robeson's bodyguard, among other things. Now, that certificate of deposit is to the Civil Rights Congress. The IWO officers, including Zaltzman, all contribute to the bail fund. And to the best of my knowledge, the checks that did that are the last checks that were actually written, that they were legally allowed to write in theory, by the JPFO. Now, Louise Thompson is very well known for her role as a hostess in the Harlem Renaissance and the founder of Solidarity Lodge and also the Sabla Lodge in Chicago. But she is an organizer on Scottsboro, and she went to Alabama where she managed to also get arrested by Bull Connor. Um, she is a formidable presence. And when I say the social glue is amazing, because she talks to anyone. She talks to people in fraternities, church groups. She is a Black feminist who reaches out to everyone, and she becomes one of the most popular vice presidents of the IWO, though she does say it's challenging to work in 15 languages that one doesn't know. Next, please. Here you see Louise with her husband, William Patterson, who's the lawyer who authored We Charge Genocide and went to Geneva. And there's also a picture of Paul Robeson with his wife Eslanda Good Robeson presenting the petition to the UN in New York. Now, William Patterson is fascinating, not least because he gets involved with the left, really, because of Scottsboro. At that point that he's a lawyer, he believes that the executions are immoral, but he also believes that intervention is critical. And his phrase is broadening the battlefield, meaning that one takes every bit of legal action one can to prevent what he calls illegal lynching. Broadening the battlefield means you have mass action that accompanies this. And this becomes really the way the whole IWO works. Telegrams, letters, rallies, broadening the field is something they understand. And this is from the Abraham Lincoln School, where Louise and Pat figured out that the Abraham Lincoln School in Chicago was running these wonderful retreats for workers, but had never had black workers. So they figured out how to get the JPFO to pay to have black workers be able to attend this retreat, which was very popular, by the way, and successful as a part of the Abraham Lincoln School that they ran. Next, please. Here is the press release that Rockwell Kent releases from what he called the Peekskill pogrom, where Robeson is doing the benefit concert in 1949 in August for the Civil Rights Congress, the CRC. And you have basically Robeson attacked, hung in effigy, Ku Klux Klan crosses, and anything that was anti-Black and anti-Semitic, that's a four-letter word and much worse, happening, and it was violent. Now, once that happens, there is a new concert in September, and some of you might know the Pete Seeger song, Hold the Line. Any Pete Seeger fans here? He's also part of this. So Hold the Line is that song from the concert that does succeed for the CRC, but the violence that happened at Peekskill was quite real. And that's upstate New York. It's really Westchester. Now, I'm going to finish up on William Patterson and go into Lemlich, and I know I am running a little over time, so I thank you for your patience. But I want you to see why I think of this as multi-dimensional memory, in which Jews and Black activists affect each other and work together. It's not just the meat boycotts. It's not just the Abraham Lincoln School. It's not just the Lena Horne concert, right, for Robeson. It's a constant type of allyship that gets forged in actions on a daily basis. And the points of connection are very real to the people involved. So you can see that We Charge Genocide opens in its introduction by mentioning what happened to the Jewish people in Nuremberg. That is what is informing in every sense this famous document, in part because that genocide, and these are non-commensurable histories that are intertwined, are deeply embedded, as Howard Fast said, in memory. And memory is something that gets forged interactively as well as in retrospectively. And we have, and We Charge Genocide, a real sense that Black leadership and resistance lost out on the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, with Reconstruction being rolled back. And if that sounds familiar today, there might be a reason. Next, please. So we're going to end here with Clara Lemlich. And those of you who know something about industrial organizing know that she led the strike of 1909. And that was called the Uprising of the 20,000. And it was a garment workers' strike. First, wildcat strike, and then it becomes a general strike, meaning everybody goes out, and 20,000 young women were considered very flighty, right? Herding cats. These are things that one hears in English and in Yiddish about them. These women, and there is a picture here of the meeting at Cooper Union in which she speaks. Clara Lemlich organizes the strike. Depending how you want to count it, it works for 11 to 13 weeks. And it gets an enormous amount of allyship. One of the three factories it targets is called the Triangle Fire Shirtwaist Factory. And of course, in 1911, it goes up in flames, and 146 people, almost all of whom are female and under 18, but are immigrants, Jewish and then Italian, die in less than 20 minutes. So Clara Lemlich is very famous. There's this lovely child's book called Brave Girl, but nobody mentions she becomes a full-fledged communist. But part of what she is dealing with is the fact that in a family economy, women have to work and so do children. And she is central to understanding what's called the woman question back in the day and the Jewish question. What do you do with Jews? Right? Can they assimilate? Who are they? What should they be? And sometimes the Jewish question, most often, is not formulated in kind ways. But Jews take up the question, and she takes it up and says, I'm a Bolshevik eventually. So next slide. And I should mention, Durkheim is not unique to the Bund, for those who are wondering. Here-ness involves one's black neighbors as well, co-territorial, whatever you want to call it, is understood differently by the Linke, but in a very profound way when it comes to race. And a little bit more on her background here, right? Because she is absolutely convinced that the key to organizing is organizing women. So one of the things I found were her letters in Yiddish, organizing housewives. And you can see a little bit of that here. And by the way, Lemlich was no nonsense type. They always end with come on time, and she professionalizes them as if they're industrial workers. It's a fascinating type of correspondence. Very dry, but very Lemlich-like. Next, please. So here is Lemlich, and somebody else, not me, found her actual card from the Progressive Women's Caucus. And you have some pictures here of from the IWO, right, including from the Emmys, about whether Miss Liberty should be deported and what does it mean to be hauled in front of the Supreme Court. But I'm going to end here with a quote that you would see at New Montefiore Cemetery, which is not a fancy cemetery. It's out at the tip of Long Island. And this is at the gate of the cemetery plots for people like Lemlich who were members and had their burial benefits. Fighters against fascism for a world of brotherhood and peace. And the Yiddish says the same thing, Kämpfer, fighters. And so whether or not one truly can understand the world from looking at a confiscated archive, I would be the first to say that there are things that were taken out of that archive. And even if we had a fully complete archive, one cannot simply catapult in the past and take tactics and strategies and fast forward them to our current times, as one says. But one can learn a hell of a lot about how people work together daily and how they articulated what they had in common and how they saw themselves. And those fighters saw themselves as fighting fascism, whether or not the world was kind to them. Next, please. So here is the shameless plug. Yes, I am the co-editor of a book and the contributor of essays to the book. And Ben Katcher are the people here who know Ben Katcher's work. And Ben Katcher, yes, I see one. Okay. Ben Katcher is a famous artist. Among other things, he's done Julius Knipple. He's also done plays. He's done many other things. But he does like the IWO and gets his fervent sense of politics and a certain humor that should accompany looking at them. Look at that newsboy. Don't you want to buy that newspaper? Now, that statue of Lenin was not really in Brownsville, where this IWO headquarters is located. I know because I provided the photo to Mr. Katcher of the IWO headquarters here. But he has let you see where Comrade Lenin is pointing, but he lets you see that the Scottsboro defendants is there, that you can buy lunch and drop into an IWO center or drop into the book and read it, and your newsboy will be your guide. Thank you very much, and please ask questions.
Sorry here. I forgot that I was unmuted, that I was muted. Okay, so if people can put their questions in the chat, that would be wonderful. I'll start with a question, which is, so what happened between the time that these with the confiscation of the materials? This happened in the 40s, correct, or the 50s?
54, they're shut down.
50. So what happened to these resources between that moment and the time they were then sort of got into your hands?
New York State gets embarrassed because it's an insurance court of law. And it's like immigration law. It has its uh, it it has its own courts of law, except these are state courts of law. And so New York State, which owns the confiscated files, and they're organizational, no love letters, right? Um, gets embarrassed and decides to deposit them. That's the polite term at Cornell because Cornell has the Kiel Center and a library. Um, that's on the state side of Cornell, which is both private and public because of Cornell's particular history in New York State. So that happens in the 70s. But some of the materials that you saw are new donations because when people realized people were researching the IWO, they started looking in their attics, their suitcases, their books, and donating them. So you have both the older donations, a couple of families' donations, and newer donations as well as the confiscated archives.
Great, thank you. So I have a question from Joel. Did the IWO have any connection to the Jewish labor Bund, and was there any remaining contact with the workers' circle?
I think the, the easiest answer is no, other than acrimony. But the longer answer is like Ruben Zaltzman and all these people who founded the IWO clearly are coming out of the Arbeiterling. And the older the person, and that includes Joe Shavelson, Clara's husband, and Reuven Zaltzman, the older they are, the better the odds are they spent quality time in Siberia after 1905. So were they Bundists in Europe? Yes, they go and find the Arbeiterling in New York, in the case of both, not entirely to their taste after the Bolshevik Revolution, and it gets acrimonious after that. It's at least 10 years of fights. Well documented, unpleasant.
Right, thank you. And there's a question whether you can clarify, you use the term vertical and horizontal, and does that equate to ethnic and allied, or can you explain that terminology?
So let's say you're Slovak, and so you stay in your Slovak world, but your lodge once a month is invited to go to a bowling league with 15 other groups, depending on what city you're in. It might have Finns or might not have Finns. Probably has Italians, right? Probably has Jews and blacks. Some groups are going to be bigger than others. The Finns are distributed in a very particular way. Um, so you might have a baseball team, the bowling team, right? You might have an ethnic pageant in which you participate as a group and show off Slovak culture and run a Slovak camp, have a Slovak newspaper. So you have both things happening. And the more time goes on, the more you're going to see those connections because of English and part, and because a younger generation that is not an immigrant born or comes younger is going to want to be more American in some sense. Just I think of the IWO as immigrant acculturation 101. Why do I say that? Every lodge, regardless of language, has to learn Robert's Rules of Order. Anybody here familiar with Robert's Rules of Order? Okay, that's very American to teach a lodge how to do that. Okay, Americanization, like the bowling leagues, but they bring people together in a very real way.
Right.
And
Well,
let me add also, sports were not integrated in America at that point, just like theater audiences or jazz audiences. So it was very, very important to Robeson that the All People's Chorus for Ballad for Americans be integrated. And it was very important to the IWO that integration, right, was not at issue in any of this stuff.
well, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for being here and for staying. And Alyssa, thank you. I know it's after uh, 10:30 your time. There is. I'm sorry. There was a question from Diana. What did you mean by there is no markup on insurance?
The way insurance works, generally speaking, is one has a package, right? Death, burial, health, whatever it is, right? And the IWO's package was very comprehensive because it included health, including TB screenings, doctors, prescriptions, everything else. So benefits, like everything in America, were sold as a package, and usually you gave yourself, as an insurer, a little bit of leeway. It's like a publisher, you have overage, right? You don't want to go broke. You want to cover your costs, and then you want to have a little bit more so you have something for your reserves or whatever. They never made money on the insurance. They were very careful to break even, and the people who volunteered were called builders, and that recruited people into the lodges because to get benefits, you had to become a lodge member. But there was no markup on those benefits, which is part of why they were so cheap and comprehensive. That was an amazing thing.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for everybody for being here. I'm going to send something tomorrow to everybody who registered, both with a link to purchase the book and with that discount that Alyssa mentioned. Sorry, you can probably hear my cat. And also with some further reading and some links, including a link to the archive that you saw materials from, so you can explore it yourself. Um, I want to thank the Worker Circle Arbitering of Northern California for making this possible. And Alyssa, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
I also put on a virtual exhibit which has a timeline because I think one of the things that's hard for people to wrap their heads around is how many things are actually connected on a world stage that you see play out locally. So when you're looking at a figure like W.E.B. Du Bois, it's very important to look at the congresses, the Pan-African congresses he's doing in Paris, or what he's doing with the founding of the NAACP, when you start talking about the history of socialism and communism and black and white histories, among other things. So that world stage is part of what I wanted to set. So when Howard sends out the link, hopefully it will also have the link to the timeline. And I welcome feedback.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, and have a good night.
A good night to all. I get to knock.